All right, this is Docendo number 44 for January 13th. Let's look at our sentence here. Albert Camus, the French philosopher, ruminates about the absurdity of the human condition in his famous essay, The Myth of Sisyphus. So, first off, we got Albert Camus, the French philosopher. Notice this phrase here is a kind of phrase that gives us more information about Camus, and it's a good phrase to use, but we need to set it off by commas. This is called a positive phrase. Basically, it's just telling us more information about the French philosopher. And again, we set those off with commas of positive phrases. Ruminates about the absurdity of the human condition in his famous essay. And it's an essay. Again, essays are smaller works, and smaller works need to have be set off and signaled as works of literature or fiction. In this case, it's an essay, so it should have quotation marks around it. We could also put that in italics, but again, if you're writing it, you put it in quotation marks to show that it's the title. It is correctly punctuated. First word's always punctuated. You don't need to punctuate smaller prepositional phrases, two-word phrases, or two-letter words rather, like of. But all of those should be capitalized. Again, notice the period will go inside of the quotation mark here. So I think that's okay now. So ruminate is a very interesting verb. Notice we get the subject here, Albert Camus ruminates. That's the basic kernel. We have an interrupting, a positive phrase here. We have a prepositional phrase here, another prepositional phrase, another prepositional phrase. See how those prepositional phrases add details. And then, of course, it ends with another positive phrase telling us about the title of the essay. So ruminate, again, is an interesting verb because it has to do with to reflect or to think very, very carefully. And it actually comes from the idea of an animal, such as a cow, chewing its cud. So it's that idea of chewing on an idea. And abdicate is another verb that means fail to fulfill or undertake a responsibility. So if you are a king and you abdicate your duties, you are abdicating the crown, so to speak. All right, so we put commas around the positive. That should make sense. We put quotations around the title. That should make sense. There's, by the way, Sisyphus, the famous character from mythology that Camus adopted for his existential philosophy. Here are a couple of definitions from the past. One who gives money to benefit humanity. Hopefully you remember that word. And a person who dislikes humanity avoids human society. Those both have that root. Anthro, having to do with humankind as in anthropology. So we have philanthropist who loves, and a misanthropist or misanthrope is somebody who dislikes humanity. Okay, then now syntax, lesson 5. Expand a sentence with adjectives, consecutive adjectives, and adjectives out of order. So we've talked about using adjectives, expanding sentences with adjectives. We know what those are. But it's also important to kind of think about when you kind of pile up adjectives, because that's something we do quite a bit. So let's say you have two adjectives and you are not sure, do I put a comma between them or not? Well, the rule is pretty simple. If you can reverse them and the sentence makes sense, you need a comma. She is a charming, thoughtful person. She is a thoughtful, charming person. So in that case, it doesn't matter. So it's kind of like I'm saying she is a charming and thoughtful person. But the comma takes the place of the "and" there. So that would be a perfectly okay sentence to use the comma with. But if you're saying the yard has a brown wooden fence, you wouldn't say the brown has a wooden brown fence. So when the order is fixed, you don't use a comma. So just remember that. If the order isn't fixed, you can flip them, use a comma. If it isn't, don't use a comma. So if we said the Bill is an inattentive, incompetent driver, could we say Bill is an incompetent, inattentive driver? Yes, we could. So therefore, we need a comma, right? Next one, Bill is an inattentive truck driver. Notice that the noun there is driver with the two adjectives inattentive and truck. In this case, we would not say Bill is a truck inattentive driver. So no comma, right? Now here's another, this one is kind of just a little rhetorical flair that it's good to be aware of, because sometimes we have adjectives before, usually they come before a noun, they modify a noun, as in the large, vicious, and angry dog barked. That's the typical way to do it. But some writers will play around with this order, this word order, and they'll say things like, the large dog, vicious and angry, barked. Notice they're setting this off with commas. It's not a positive, it's two adjectives describing the dog, but because it comes after, it just gives the sentence a little bit of a different flair. Both of these are correct, before or after. But it's just good to know that little bit of flexibility of how you can change things up, and sometimes using adjectives out of order, especially if you have a lot of adjectives, is a good way to go. So I could say the beautiful, graceful swan glided across the water, perfectly fine. Or I could say adjectives out of order, the swan, beautiful and graceful, glided across the water. Notice if it comes after, I use commas around it because it's not the typical order between the subject and the verb here. Okay, so adjectives out of order and consecutive adjectives, that should make sense. Again, just another little way of expanding what we've been talking about with syntax. All right, that is Docendo 44.